Hi, this is Jeff from the Ozark Mountains in Missouri, USA. Well, this is the follow-up to the episode we did a month or so ago about my friend's Tandy 102, which he sent to me to have a look at. And if you recall, we found a lot of corrosion on the board from a leaking NiCad battery, and we got it mostly working, booting again, got rid of the LCD corruption, but the system bus port still wasn't working right. And this is also the one that we did the episode on how to fix that flat flex cable. At any rate, I've been working on this on and off for several weeks now, and we'll take a look at what we found and how we eventually got to a working machine, and then we'll come back and wrap it up. Thanks to PCBWay for sponsoring this video. They do circuit boards of all sizes, small circuit boards, medium circuit boards. They can even assemble them for you. Be sure to check out their website and the 4th design contest, which is running right now. So head on over to PCBWay for all of your PCB needs. So we have our test harness installed on our troublesome T102 board. I'm using some tape to hold the ROM board down because I'm having to flip-flop this around when working on it. I was knocking this loose. I modified the test firmware so it just loops in between the parallel port test and the system bus test. These both use the system bus, so it was an easy way to get that to twiddle the needed bits. And you can see I've soldered on a couple wires here to make connecting the oscilloscope easier. This black wire is just a ground, and the white wire here goes to pin 19 of M39, which triggers that buffer chip. This buffers the lower address and data bits to the system bus. The Model 100 does not have this chip. So I wanted to see if this was being triggered because it didn't look like these bits, these lower address data bits, were being written to the system bus. So let's have a look at the scope. The yellow trace is our white wire. That's pin 19 of M39, which triggers that buffer. And the blue, I don't have hooked up to anything right now. If I put this on single shot, you notice in one case when we're doing the parallel port test, we get a short pulse. And then when we get to the system bus test, get a nice long pulse. Both of those should be about the same, and it made me curious why we were getting that short pulse. I also noticed that when I had the test harness hooked up with the LCD, I had slightly different results read back from the system bus and printer port test, which just smacks of more bus contention, but where, everything is connected to those 8 lower address / data pins. So it's kind of a conundrum. So then I got the probing around on what I'm going to do here is probably just see my arm sticking in there. I'm going to change the triggering to channel 2, which is our blue trace. And we'll run the level up to about there. And we'll look at some of our address and data lines. See, that one looks okay. I think that's A0. 81. You notice, you can just see here, we're getting these random short spikes. See if I can single shot capture that. Yeah. Now, this would be a normal, kind of short spike. This guy right here is a little odd. And there are a couple of pins, I think it's address 1 and address 2, 81, 82, that we have that on. So I studied my really blurry schematic here to see what that could be. Now, as you recall, we replaced the one keyboard buffer chip last time, and that got everything mostly working again. And it could be that the other buffer chip is also bad, but it's just mostly working. And that's pretty likely because, the one was bad. We had some electrical damage there. The other is M39 here itself. which is this guy. Now there could be some corrosion under this chip. We have all 8 of those, you know, 80 to 87 lines running to this guy, and if there's some corrosion under there or this chip is bad, it could be causing a problem. I don't know why that would cause that weird spike thing, other than it might be throwing off some timing, because 81 and 82 have those weird spiky doos on there. So I think the first thing we'll try is taking off that other keyboard buffer chip, because it'll run fine without it. If we see the same problem, then we'll try this guy. I've used some Kaptan tape to protect the area around that chip that we want to remove, that second keyboard buffer chip. And the first thing I like to do is apply a little fresh solder, and then I'll use the hot air gun to heat up the whole chip, paying special attention to those little red dabs on the end, which is the glue that held the chip in place during soldering. Well, we're having a bit of a Kenny Rogers moment here. We took a gamble that we could fix all this corrosion, and now we're at the point where we need to know if we want to hold them or fold them. And I'm thinking we might want to fold them on this guy. Now, I pulled this other keyboard latch, which didn't change the symptoms. Not super surprised there. And then I pulled up M39. Let's get a close-up there. Yeah, so as you can see, I've been polishing on this with the fiberglass pen. This was really corroded under here. This big trace right here, which comes up through that via, was really corroded to the point it started separating from the board. There's a little dot of corrosion under the switch here. I'm guessing if I pull up these 2 chips, we're going to have more corrosion there. I don't know if I pointed this out before. I found another spot of corrosion just here, but all those traces seem to be intact, but there could be other stuff that's snuck around somewhere. And I got to looking really closely, and there is some corrosion back in this connector. You can just see some of the telltale blue right there, and these are very, very difficult to pull off. You can see there's some here as well. So, what to do? So I went and grabbed my parts board, and this is actually in physically much better shape than my friend's board here, but it's got some missing parts because I've been pulling parts off of it. And the only really questionable looking thing on here is where somebody's added these socket strips in here. I'll have to check all the soldering on the back there, and I want to pull the battery compartment and look underneath it to make sure there's no corrosion there, but from the contacts it looks okay. So providing this thing looks corrosion free, I think what I will do is throw in the towel on this board, since we're uncovering more and more corrosion, and if I do get it working, who knows how long it's going to stay working. I'll transfer parts from here to this board, and we'll make one good board out of it, have something that's reliable for my friend to use. So the first thing I want to do on this new board, which was the parts board, is to pull that battery holder off and look underneath it, because that is a prime space for corrosion from leaking batteries. Then we'll clean that whole area up so we can have a good look. I like using a small flat blade screwdriver to get the worst corrosion off some of the larger areas, and then I'll go over everything with the fiberglass pen. We'll go ahead and tin all that freshly revealed copper with some solder, and then we'll clean it up with some alcohol. Now we'll turn our attention to those socket strips that somebody had installed. I'm going to clean all those joints to start with to see what there is to work with, and then I'll desolder them a few at a time and go ahead and resolder them, and hopefully that'll take care of any problems that might be lurking there. And now we'll start replacing all the missing chips. We'll add a little flux onto the pads first, set the chips in place, hold them there with tweezers while we solder. And of course, we want to clean up the soldering mess we just made. We'll use some alcohol, a toothbrush, and an old rag made from a t-shirt. Well, getting ready to do the first test on a repurposed board here. Notice what I found on the DC jack here. This one is completely cracked. That one is starting. So I'll need to resolder the DC input jack here. So after swapping in the missing chips, this thing didn't run, and I found there was a little wackiness with the power jack, so I swapped it over from my friend's original board here. It still wasn't running, and the chip I'd soldered on the bottom here, that keyboard latch, I pulled it back off because I got it on there a little crooked. It didn't look like it was shorting, but it'll run without it, so I just went and pulled it off. Still didn't help. And, I had resoldered this socket or socket strips that someone had put on here because the soldering job wasn't the best. And I thought, well, I should check to see if there's any shorts. So I went along like this, checking from pin to pin. Everything was fine until I got to pin 1 and 2 here. And neither one of those seemed to be connected to anything, let alone shorted to each other, which is kind of odd. I could see one of them because in a EEPROM pinout, there's one pin that'll be the programming voltage pin, and it won't be connected to anything in usage. That happens to be pin 1 here. But why was pin 2 open as well? So I desoldered these guys. This is a reenactment here. See if we can get... Yeah, so here we can see what happened. They did a good job desoldering this side, whoever put those socket strips in there originally. Right here, it looks like maybe they dug a screwdriver or something underneath here to try to pry up the original ROM, and it broke this trace, which goes to one of the address lines here, and it ripped up the pads on the top on a few things, and from this pin here down here to pin 2, there should be a connection, and there is not. Pin 1 is not connected, and the rest of them are connected on the bottom, so those aren't a big deal. But I'll have to add a couple jumpers here, and then I took the socket off my friend's original board that I put on there, and I'll put this socket on here, and we will give it a try again. Well, we know this dance by now. It's time to install a few more jumpers, but luckily there's just a few this time. We'll mark the location, we'll cut and strip them, we'll apply them to the board nicely, and then we'll solder them in place. And then we'll go ahead and ohm out each line going to that ROM socket to other places on the board, just to make sure that all of our connections are good. And here we're in the system bus and parallel port bus test that we failed in before. And luckily they are both passing this time. So I can go ahead and reflash the full test firmware on the ROM board, and we'll give it a full test. Okay, now we've got it all deoxided or deoxidized, whatever. I'm going to take my trace sealing pin here. Kind of go over these traces that were just a little bit corroded under the battery box. This Circuit Works overcoat pin just helps protect that. Okay, now we'll let this guy sit overnight to let our sealant here cure. I'll reprogram the EEPROM one here with a full test instead of a modified test, and we will clean up the battery box and solder that back on and give it a full test and see what happens. Okay, we've got everything reassembled, and you can see I've got the keyboard and LCD hooked up and the whole test harness. So we will go through and try to test this guy out. I'm going to zoom in on the test LCD. Here we go. Now the first time through we get that preceding decimal place before the M. That just means that it's the first time we run the test and the RAM was not backed up because I just put the battery in. And yes, the LCD did come on and it looks great. I'll get another shot of that for you and cut it in here. We'll go ahead and let the full test run here, but I sped it up 8 times just so it's not so boring. Excellent. Everything is working. Okay, we passed the complete test. That's great news. So, this board is working fine, but curiosity got the best from me, and I wanted to see if on this working board we saw the same funny spiky pulse on M39 here, and the same kind of really short pulses on address lines 1 and 2. So I changed the test firmware back to that looping test between the system bus and the printer port, and soldered my wires back on there. We'll take a look at the O-scope now. Okay, I'll put it on single shot. That is the printer port, or here, we'll try it again. It's on single shot. That is the system bus. And that is the printer port. So we still do have the little spiky-do thing. And if we set our trigger menu for channel 2 again, change our level up to something like this. Yep, we still got our little spike right there. So that was another red herring. So what I was chasing there at the end, this thing and that short gate pulse for M39, those were perfectly okay. So I'm certain there is some hidden corrosion on that first board. So I think what we ought to do is have a further look at that and take off some of those chips in that area where all the corrosion was and see what we see. Let's go ahead and remove some of our bodge wires here so we can get an idea of how corroded it is under these ICs. This is probably something I should have done to begin with. And then we'll just use the hot air gun and some tweezers to zip those chips right off of this board. Here is a bit of an overview of our circuit board. I've placed little pieces of blue tape on where I found corrosion after my initial inspection. This one right here, this is dark spot right here, I just found a few minutes ago. And I pulled these capacitors over here just now and I found a little more corrosion under here. There's a spot over here by where the ROM was, just a little teeny tiny spot right there. And of course we just pulled these 3 chips, and in that area, in this area, there was some corrosion right off this pin, and I can't zoom in close enough so you can see it with this camera, but it's bad enough that this trace is kind of shaped like this now. And this big trace that was all corroded here is also corroded just past this pin here. Of course, there was this little bit we found under the switch. Yeah, so I would say it was probably a good idea to stop trying to fix this board, because even if I had gotten it all the way working, there was enough hidden corrosion on here, it might not have lasted too long. And now we've got my friend into another board that's physically in better shape. We're able to take parts from both and kind of put them together and make one good board that I'll test out fine. Well, I'm not one that likes to throw in the towel, but sometimes you have to know, like Kenny Rogers says, when to hold them and when to fold them, and this is definitely a case to know when to fold them and move on to a circuit board that was in a lot better shape. After I did that, I found even more corrosion on this original board, so it's a good thing we decided to go a different route, even though I'd already put hours of work into this thing. Sometimes that's what you wind up with. But the good news is we've got my friend a nice working 102 again, and I still have a parts board with lots of good ICs, which is what I started with, so everybody came out a winner. I hope you found this helpful. We did learn a lot on this on troubleshooting and chasing red herrings with those funny spiky signals, which turned out to be perfectly normal. Who knew? At any rate, if you have any questions or comments, well, just leave them in that comment section down there below. I would love to hear from you. And thanks to everyone who helps support the Hey Birt channel through Patreon and other means. It is greatly appreciated. Well, until next time, bye.